As we start talking about the topic of is it rational to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, I want you to first think about, just look at the calendar. What year is this? Well, 2022, right? But why is it 2022? Why not some other number? Why do we count those years and why is it now 2022? Well, the reason is that we count, it's now 2022 because that's the number of years that passed since Jesus was born. Well, that's at least how it should be. Technically, people who made the calendar at some point decided to count the numbers from when Jesus was born, and they made a slight mistake. So it's not exactly 2022 from Jesus' birth, but that's how we count. So something important happened there 2,000 years ago, and we will look at what was so remarkable about Jesus that made it into our calendars. So, who was Jesus? Jesus was a Jewish person who lived in ancient Israel about 2,000 years ago, and he was, so at the time, the Jews were expecting that one day there will be a person who will solve the problem of their sins, who will maybe save them from the occupiers, because at the time Rome was occupying Israel, and they were expecting someone to come and solve their problems, a savior. And Jesus claimed to be that savior. He said that he has come to the world to solve the problem of that most affects all of humanity, not only the Israelites, but everyone in the world. So what do Jesus believe about, what do Christians believe about Jesus? So why does it even matter, right? Maybe it's insignificant, but I think that it's a very significant thing. Because Christians believe that God exists, first. We'll talk about it later, maybe there are reasons to believe that God exists. But Christians believe that God exists and that He is holy. And we, as people, we have disobeyed God. We have done something wrong, and that makes us guilty against God. And the only solution, so suppose I steal someone's car, and I get caught, and then I go to court. Really, if I'm really the criminal, I need to pay the price. I cannot say, oh, but look at how good I am. I give money to charity. I help so many people. It doesn't matter. I'm still guilty, right? So it doesn't matter how good we live. In front of God, we're guilty. And Jesus says that actually He is God, and He came to pay the price that I deserve. So the guilty verdict that lays on me is now put on Jesus, and He died instead of me dying. So God was angry with me, but Jesus paid the price for it. He decided to take it on Himself. So that's very significant. Second thing, if Jesus indeed rose from the dead, that means that He is right. So all of His teachings are correct. Then we can say that Christianity is true, the religious belief called Christianity. And we can say also that death has been beaten. Death is not the end. It's possible, well, if one person did it and he promises to give life to other people, that they also will rise one day from the dead, then maybe that's true. So that would have very big consequences, right? So it does matter whether Jesus rose from the dead. So I'm inviting you to consider now, as we look into the evidence, turn on your minds, because this is not going to be just telling you because, oh, the Bible tells me that Jesus rose from the dead, so it happened. No, we will look at this critically and answer the question, did it really happen? Because if it did, it's very important. If it didn't, that means that all of Christian faith is basically nonsense. It is not worth anything. And that's what even the earliest Christians believed, that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, it's all worthless. So, yeah, now I'll give the floor to Heng, who will introduce the methodology.
Right. Hello again. As I said, my name is Heng, and thank you for that insightful opening. I think before we proceed, maybe it's worth saying a few words. First thing is that it's been years since I engaged in public speaking, so if there's blunders along the way, you will have to just forgive me. Yes? And second, I think there'll be Q&A at the end, so if you're listening along and you have questions, feel free to note it down and ask us at the end. So I think we should go ahead now. Yes. So I think first, it's important to talk about our expectations and methodology. So I just want to make it clear that we're not looking for proof with the certainty of that of a mathematical equation. And I think, in fact, perhaps you'll be surprised that in many things in life, we don't rely on mathematical proofs. So for example, this morning I told Tony that our boiler was broken. And he just had to trust me on my testimony, you know. He couldn't ask me, or I couldn't provide a mathematical proof that the boiler was broken. So again, many things in life we rely on testimony. And when dealing with historical data, documents, and so on, we're not looking for certainty. Again, we're just looking for the best explanation and trying to establish probability, whether or not the evidence indicates that this event or that event probably happened or probably not. So now the question is that how do we investigate the historical event in the resurrection of Jesus? So we'll use the historical method, which is set out in 4 criteria. The first one is it says that the earlier sources are preferred. So for example, in talking about Jesus, it was born in the 1st century. So if we have a source in the 1st century and another source in the 11th century, the source that is in the 1st century is to be preferred. Second, what's called multiple attestation by independent sources. So if we have different authors at different time, different texts saying the same thing, that raises the probability of that event. And third is the more confirmation of events by unfavorable sources, the better. So for example, we think about people who were not in favor of Christians, like the Roman or the Jews in the 1st century. If they confirm certain things that the Christian claim, that also give us a higher probability. And the last one is called the Principle of Embarrassment. Basically means that when an author admits embarrassing information. So for example, let me think about a quick example. So if a husband out of nowhere admits to his wife that he cheated on her, especially when he has everything to lose and nothing to gain, he probably cheated on her. Otherwise, why would he admit this embarrassing information? So I just want to make sure that we did not make this up. So these are, criteria used by professional historians and so on. Yes. So now is like, you might ask, what kind of data are we looking at? Of course, we'll be looking at the Christian sources. And in looking at the Christian sources, I want to make sure that we'll be treating Christian sources as historical documents, not the Word of God, not an errant text without errors or anything like that. We'll be just treating them as historical documents, just like any other documents. So our primary text we have is the 4 biographies of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then you might say, hey, these books are in the Bible. How can you use it as historical text? Well, my friend, before they were in the Bible, they were written by separate authors at different places and times and so on. later on they were put in the Bible. Maybe let me help you think about it this way. They're not reliable because they are in the Bible, but they are in the Bible because they are reliable, if that makes sense. So these were all written by eyewitnesses in the first century. So, and also we have Paul's letters. So for those who don't know, Paul was an early enemy of the church. He went around hunting Christians, and then later he became a Christian, and he wrote a lot of letters to people across the Roman Empire, and he's one of the best sources when it comes to information about Jesus. And also we'll be using an early creed from the church, the 1 Corinthian 15 church creed. This goes back very, very early. A lot of atheist scholars, they're not even Christian, they're atheists. They say that this creed dated back to 2 to 3 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. And another guy called James Dunn even says that this creed developed 6 months after the crucifixion of Jesus. So we have our evidence pretty early. So we also have the book of Acts, which documents missionary trips of the early Christian in the first century and the growth of the early church. Of course, we try to find a balance always in what we do. We also, give a fair treatment to non-Christian sources from the Roman historian Tacitus, Josephus, and Philo as well. Jewish sources. So our method in looking at the resurrection is called the minimum fact argument, pioneered by a guy called Gary Habermas. So we'll be looking at, so historians disagree a lot when it comes to the New Testament and so on, atheists and Christians and so on. But the majority, not all of them, but the majority of them agree on these 4 facts. So facts number 1, the death of Jesus by the Roman crucifixion. Facts number 2, the tomb burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea. Facts number 3, the discovery of the empty tomb by a woman. 4, the conviction of the risen Jesus and thus the transformation of the disciples. So before we look at the possible explanations, so let's look at all of these facts. The first fact is Jesus died by crucifixion. So as I said, we'll be looking at the Christian sources as well. Our sources, our primary sources from the Christian sources is the 4 biographies of Jesus. That is from Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. They are all in unity in agreeing that Jesus was in fact crucified. So for example, I have a quotation from Mark 15:24 here, and they crucify him, and on and on. So the Gospel of Mark was written about somewhere between 65 to 70 AD, so well within the first century. And also, most scholars, they believe that, so in the Gospel of Mark, there is this thing called the Passion narrative, which is basically the story from the time that Jesus enters Jerusalem all the way, all the way to the discovery of the empty tomb by the woman. So even though the Gospel of Mark dated back to between 65 to 70 AD, this source of the Passion story, it goes way back to somewhere between 40 to 50 AD. So that's pretty close to the event itself. And we also have Paul's letters, talking over and over again about Jesus being crucified. So one is from Galatians 3:1, Christ was publicly betrayed as crucified. And also have Peter's speech from Acts testifying that Jesus was crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. So, and then you might ask, hey, let's suppose that Mark was written in 65 AD. That's 30 years after Jesus died and so on. But remember this, the first biography of Alexander the Great was written 400 years after he died. And here we have the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, all written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, all within the first century. So, folks, I think we have historical treasure in our hands here. So they're written pretty early, by the ancient standards. So we also have non-Christian sources. The first one is from the Jewish historian Josephus. So here, written somewhere in the 90s, testifying to Jesus, being condemned by Jewish men of high ranking, and therefore was crucified. So it, well in harmony with what the gospel tells us, even though this person was not a Christian. And also another reference is from Tacitus, the Roman historian. Remember the Romans, they were not for Christian, but they were against Christian. But here we have evidence that they confirm in fact. So here Tacitus talks about the Emperor Nero inflicting tortures on Christian. And he mentions somebody called Christus, which is a Latin word for Christ. He mentioned somebody called Christus, which is the name that the word Christians come from, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. So you might say well, he's not referring to crucifixion, but extreme penalty. But crucifixion in the first century was always referred to as an extreme penalty, usually reserved for people committed treason against the Roman Empire. And we also have another reference from the philosopher Lucian, somewhere in the mid-2nd century, talking about the founder of the Christian faith being crucified on that account. So, yes, so another piece of evidence that I thought this was very interesting to throw out there. So the Jews, they believed that a crucified person was cursed by God. So let's suppose that this crucifixion story were made up, and they wanted the Jews to believe. If I were to make up a story, why would I make up a story that people wouldn't find believable? Because they think that the crucified people are cursed by God. So for example, Paul also mentioned Christ crucified was a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to Gentiles, because the Jews, they believed that crucified people were cursed by God. So they found it hard to believe. But if I were to make up a story, I would find a way to make up a better story that people would find more believable, not somebody being crucified. So I think this tells us something that this probably happened. So I just want a summary again. We have the crucifixion of Jesus is multiply attested by both early and independent sources, Matthew, Luke, and John. And then Paul's letters, Acts, and non-Christian sources and so on. And also we have embarrassing information of the crucifixion. Crucifixion was seen as shameful and disgraceful, cursed by God, and so on. And yet, the Christians who go around and telling this story, proclaiming they enjoy. So I have a quote here from John Dominic Crossan, who is a skeptic, New Testament scholar. He says that the crucifixion of Jesus is as sure as anything historical can ever be. And I would claim here, even if we didn't have the Gospels, even if nobody wrote the Gospel, we could still know what happened to Jesus based on the writing of Josephus and Tacitus alone. So the evidence is pretty strong. It's that obvious. And I couldn't stand here and tell you that Jesus was not crucified with a straight face, because the evidence is pretty strong. So fact number 2 is the burial in the tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. Once again, the Christian sources, we have all the 4 Gospels telling us that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. So I have a quote from Mark here, our earliest Gospel, saying that Joseph of Arimathea took down the body and placed it in a tomb, cut out of rock, and he rolled the stone against the entrance of the tomb. Once again, this empty tomb narrative, this burial in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea is part of what's called the Passion narrative. It's dated pretty early, somewhere between the 40 and 50. And I have a quote from the liberal scholar here, not conservative Christian, that says that the burial of Jesus must be accepted as one of the most firmly grounded facts of Jesus' life. So the evidence is pretty strong. So I don't want to just throw the text out there, but let us think about the text and wrestle with them a little bit. So here's the thing. So Dale Allison, New Testament scholar, he notes that to depict a member of a Sanhedrin, a member, Joseph of Arimathea. If you don't know Joseph of Arimathea, who buried Jesus, he was a member of the Jewish court who condemned and killed Jesus in the first place. So to depict this person doing a kindness to Jesus goes against the tendency of the gospel authors. And the gospel authors were uncomfortable with this fact, yet they had to mention it because it happened. So for example, John and Matthew, they did not mention he was a member of the Sanhedrin. And they had to stress that he was exceptional. For example, John calling him a secret disciple and Matthew calling him rich man. No mention about him being a member of the Sanhedrin. Luke mentioned that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, but he had to stress that this guy was a good and upright man. So it's like saying, well, he was a member of the Jewish court who just murdered Jesus, but he was a good guy. So trust us. So another point is that the name Joseph, so Joseph of Arimathea means that somebody named Joseph from a place called Arimathea. And Dale Allison notes that these name and place are very obscure, meaning that people know very little about them. So it adds very little credibility to the story. So, once again, if I were to invent a story, I would think of a place that a lot of people know. So, for example, London or Manchester or something. I wouldn't think about an obscure place that a lot of people don't know. So another interesting point is that this guy called Joseph of Arimathea, he just popped up, and then he buried Jesus, and then he vanished. That's very interesting. So once again, if this story, which is made up to pump up the credibility of the story, to make it more believable, why not have him continue on in that story? For example, being a witness of the risen Jesus and so on. It's very, I think it's, that would be a better story to make up. But, of course, another piece of evidence is from the 1 Corinthian 15 Creed, dated back very early, like I said, 2 or 3 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. So, once again, Paul tells us in this creed, in the creed that he quoted, that Jesus was buried. And Dale Allison, again, he notes that the word bury here in Greek implies a proper burial instead of a dump of a criminal into an unmarked trench as dog food. So, yes. So also we have independent sources from Roman practice. So I have the first 2 citations is about the Romans. From the Roman law, they encourage the burial of criminals. So it says here that if somebody asks for the body to be buried, it should be granted, and this, it makes sense because Joseph did ask for the body from the Roman, and it was given to him. So, the Roman laws and the gospel account, they're all in harmony with each other. So the last one is from Josephus. I think that he references Deuteronomy chapter 21, 22 here, which says that the body of crucified victims should be taken down and buried before sunset, otherwise it would defile the land. So we know from Josephus that the Jewish people, they were very serious about burying dead bodies, especially the bodies of crucified victims. Yes, I have also have more evidence from Philo, Dead Sea Scroll, Tobit, Sanhedrins, on and on. I could go through them one by one, but I'm not going to do it today because it will take all night. But if you're interested in looking at it yourself, come and ask me, I'll give it to you. So these are all more references and evidence that testifying to the burial of crucified victims. So just a summary here, I give 2 pieces of evidence from the Roman law that the Roman encouraged the burial of crucified victims. And I also show 2 references, one from Deuteronomy and another one from Josephus, that the Jews, they were serious about bearing people who were crucified. And we put here the word hang on a tree. You might say, well, is that different to crucify? No, it's not different. According to the scholar Raymond Brown, hang on a tree or hang was a synonym for the word crucify or crucifixion. And we also have strong data that Jesus was given a proper burial by Joseph of Arimathea. Once again, we have the four Gospels, Paul's letters, on and on. So it's multiply attested by independent sources, very early sources as well. So therefore, the Jesus burial can be regarded as a fact of history. So fact number 3, the discovery of the empty tomb by the woman. So once again, evidence, primary evidence is the four Gospels, the four biographies of Jesus. They all agree and record that the tomb was found empty by a group of women. So for example, quotation from John here, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early and saw the stone had been taken away from the tomb, and that Jesus taking out of the tomb, and they don't know where he has been laid. So, the fact that the Gospel mentioned that this was discovered by the woman is very significant, given the fact that the first century Judea was very misogynist and rarely valued and wanted the testimony of women. So, I'll show you why later. But so it's just here a few references that they really did not value the testimony of women at all. So. First reference is from Josephus, and the last one, sooner let the words of the Lord be burned than delivered to a woman. That's pretty horrific, but whoever wrote that, he had deep issues. So yes, so I mentioned two things. First one is that the empty tomb was discovered by a woman. Second, the testimony of women were not significant. So how do these two things play out together? So yes, they are significant, because if you were to invent a story, why would you include characters like the woman that could hurt the credibility of a story as primary witnesses? Like, it would seem better if you just want people to believe in this story. It seems to me that it would be better to just, include one of the male disciples. So you could have Joseph of Arimathea discovering the empty tomb. People would find that more believable. Or you could conclude Nicodemus or Peter or somebody like that, because they were males, people would find them more believable. So why include the woman, serious candidates, back in the first century, of hurting the credibility of the story, So, and after all, there was nothing to stop them from being creative, or, it was just made up, So if the story was just an invention, it would have been better to include, male witnesses rather than a woman. But they include women, so judging this by the principle of embarrassment, because this would seem embarrassing to the author, we can conclude that the empty tomb is historically credible. A third piece is that we have enemy attestation of the empty tomb. So what this means is that if we have people who were not in favor of Christianity confirming something, that gives more credibility to the story. So we have Jewish polemic of stolen body. So in Matthew, the guards came back from the tomb and reported to the Jewish authorities about what had happened. Probably the empty tomb, and also probably the stone being rolled away. And the response of the Jewish leaders was that, tell people his disciple came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. So when somebody believes or says that, the body was stolen, that means they believe or presuppose that the tomb was empty. Otherwise, you could just say, well, the body is still there, So we have an enemy attestation here of the empty tomb. So this one is last one. Not last one, but called the Jerusalem factor. So what this means is that Jesus was executed in Jerusalem. And also his resurrection and empty tomb were proclaimed in Jerusalem as well. So the Jewish and Roman authorities, they were not against, they were against Christian. So, if in fact the body was still in the tomb, it would have been very easy for them to destroy Christianity. They could just point out, look, you guys are talking nonsense. The body is still there, But yeah, they didn't do any of this. It seems to me like everybody believed that the tomb was empty. So yeah, they could, if the tomb wasn't empty and the corpse was still there, you could just take the corpse out and display it publicly and tell people like, all of these disciples, all of these Christians were crazy, that the body is still there. But that didn't happen. So once again, the empty tomb is part of the early pre-Markan Passion narrative. So the point is that it goes very, very early, close to the event, within eyewitness testimony. And also an interesting point is from later texts. So going into from the 2nd century forward. So when we examine the later texts, we see that they are very uncomfortable with the fact that the earlier gospel mentioning women being the primary witnesses of the empty tomb, and they try to cut down their role, to be unimportant. So, for example, we have the quote-unquote the Gospel of Peter. I don't think it's gospel, but we can talk about that later. The Gospel of Peter has male soldiers and a crowd of Jews witnessed the resurrection firsthand, and with the woman only showing up redundantly later to see the aftermath. They are not given any message to testify. So the point I'm trying to make here is that some people in the 2nd century, late into the 2nd century, and they look at the gospel from the 1st century who were written by eyewitnesses, and they were not happy at all with the fact that the woman was in fact the primary witnesses to the empty tomb, and they try to change it. So that tells you that it was probably the woman who discovered it. And the same thing with the Gospel of Mary, minimizing the role of woman. So in summary, just to go through everything again, I know I've given you a lot of information. Trust me, I've cut out a lot. It could have been way more. But by the principle of embarrassment, we can conclude the historicity of the empty tomb. So the woman being the primary witnesses of the empty tomb. By the principle of embarrassment, give more credibility to the story. And the enemy attestation. So, for example, the Jewish authority presupposed that the tomb was empty. Jerusalem factor. The Christian message, and the empty tomb was proclaimed in Jerusalem. And if the body was still in there, it would have been very easy for the Roman and Jews to destroy Christianity by just simply displaying and showing the body, but they couldn't do that because the body was not in the tomb. We also have multiple attestation of early sources, the 4 biographies of Jesus. Like the point I just made, later authors were uncomfortable with the woman's role and therefore tried to reduce it. So all of these factors combined, I think we have pretty good evidence that the tomb was empty. So Tim will take over from now. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so the 4th fact that's left here for our case is the fact that the disciples believed that Jesus rose again. So I'm going to show you a bit of context, because if you're making up a story, this particular story goes against the Jewish thought. So the Jews did not have a concept, were not expecting an individual, one person, to rise again. They did believe in the resurrection. Pharisees had even discussions against, or arguments against Sadducees, whether there was resurrection or not. But the Jews believed in the resurrection as a general resurrection just before the day of judgment. So at the end of the world, everyone would be raised back to life, and they will face God in the judgment. But they did not have so they did not have a concept of a Messiah, so that their Savior. They were waiting for a Savior. They did not have a concept of him dying, let alone rising again. They would have the disciples would have been basically just devastated by the death, with no real hope. And that's what we see. For example, Martha, one of the sisters of Lazarus, talks to Jesus, and he says, "Your brother will rise." So Lazarus died, and Jesus says after 4 days, "Your brother will rise again." And the sister says, "Yeah, I know he will rise again on the last day." So just before essentially at the end of the world. But Jesus said, "No, I am the resurrection," and he brought him back to life then. But it shows the expectation was that, the resurrection would be on the last day. We also have this early creed, which Heng mentioned that it dates back to 2 to 3 years after the crucifixion. So I want to show you that the disciples believed. So we are not talking, did Jesus appear to them? We are here trying to show that at least they believed, sincerely believed, that he appeared to them. So Paul, in his letter, he is writing to Corinthians, to the church in Corinth, and he is trying to show that, or establish his credibility, because the church in Corinth didn't exactly believe that maybe Paul is credible or something like that. And he is saying, hey, what I'm proclaiming is actually something, it's not my invention, it's something that the earliest Christians believe. So he is passing on what he received. And this is the creed that he quotes. The green passages are the statements of the creed, and the blue ones are his sentences that he says to the church. So he says, I delivered to what I also received, that Jesus Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, that is the Jewish name for Peter, Apostle Peter, then to the 12, meaning the 12 apostles. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, so there was some sort of group appearance. And then he even adds a parenthetical statement, most of whom they're still alive, but although some have fallen asleep, meaning they've died. But you could consult them. Then he appeared to James, and here he refers to the Jesus' brother, skeptical brother, James, and then to all the apostles. And then he says, last of all, he also untimely born, so at a different time, he also appeared to me. So Paul also claims that he's witnessed risen Jesus. So this is the early creed. The early creed, it wasn't a later invention that they made up this resurrection later as a legend. It was the belief at the very beginning of the Christian movement. Okay, so the 500 people often are excited about the 500 people. Oh, you see how many witnesses, but they're actually anonymous. We don't really know who they are, and the receivers, the Corinthians themselves, wouldn't be actually able to know. You cannot say that there are 500, or you cannot confirm there are 500 if you don't know who to even ask. So I'm not going to actually use that as evidence. But we do have evidence about certain witnesses who are named, and any person reading the Gospels and the accounts, any person could have gone and checked, gone and talked to them. So first of all, a very important source is Mary Magdalene. She is attested in 4 Gospels, in 4 different sources, that she was there and saw risen Jesus. Then the second person that the Gospels mention in 3 places is Mary, the mother of James the Younger. In some places it just, I think Matthew refers to that Mary as the other Mary. James the Younger was one of the disciples of Jesus. Salome, also, Mark says that Salome was also one of, in that group of women. And then Johanna, Luke tells us that. So, actually, the first three, Mary Magdalene, that other Mary, and Salome, they are in the pre-Mark and Passion narrative, so in the earliest source, actually. So in that Mark, when you see Mark, that's our most important source. Then the Creed, the three Gospels and the Creed agree that Jesus also appeared to 12 apostles, so anyone could go and ask any of the apostles. Bear in mind that when we say the 12, Judas hanged himself and he betrayed Jesus, so there were actually 11, but then they selected one more, Matthias, and the criterion for selection was that he also witnessed everything. So they attest that the 12th apostle, the new 12th apostle, also witnessed it. And then it has also a specific emphasis. In certain places we have a specific emphasis that Peter also saw Jesus. We get, again, from the Creed and from Acts, we learn about James. He was skeptical initially of Jesus. John's Gospel tells us that the brothers of Jesus did not believe in him, in who he was or who he claimed to be. But then in Acts, it appears that James is actually chairing one of the most important meetings, the Council of Nicaea. Council of Jerusalem. And so clearly he became a believer. And then Luke also mentions on the road to Emmaus, Cleopas and some other person. They witnessed Jesus. There is a name. Anyone could come and ask Cleopas if he saw. And then, in the end, we have Paul, who was an enemy of the Christian church, and he also suddenly, out of nowhere, on the road to Damascus, became a Christian. He reports that himself. It's also recorded by Luke. To repeat, the James and Paul, they are actually skeptical people, and they had no reason to believe it unless it really happened. They weren't emotionally attached to their belief to Jesus initially. So essentially, we have good sources, and our explanations will have to also account for how do we explain the fact of these skeptical people becoming Christians. Finally, how do we know that they sincerely believed? That's what they said, but how do we know they really believed what they said? Maybe they were lying. So Peter and John, we know that actually the Christian preaching was dangerous. So, for example, we read that Peter and John, very quickly, they were arrested for talking about Jesus' death. Then, the chapter later, we read that the apostles, maybe all of them, it says plural, so at least 3, were arrested and beaten for their message. Then we learn about Stephen. So we don't know whether Stephen was an eyewitness to the resurrection, but he was seized, tried, and then stoned to death. And that, on the day when that happened, that started a persecution against the church. So anyone after that, the disciples, if they were preaching, they were really putting their lives at risk. They could have been killed. We don't know if all of them were killed for their faith, but we do know that they never actually took back any of their words. They were preaching knowing that that it's dangerous. We know, in fact, that James was killed. So James, the brother of John the disciple. So James the disciple is not the same, not brother of Jesus, is one of the disciples, James. He was killed, and Peter was imprisoned by Herod. And then we also, in the end, we know that the Christian tradition says that Peter was crucified under Caesar Nero. We do know that by the time John is writing his gospel, he is hinting at the fact that Jesus predicted even the fact that Peter will be crucified. So John is recording Jesus say that one day you will stretch out your hands and someone else will take you to that place you don't want to go. And John then says this is what Jesus meant. Jesus meant here to explain how Peter will be dying. So in spite of all of this, that it was clearly dangerous to preach about this risen Jesus. The message was dangerous, but no one of the witnesses has ever taken back their words, recanted. So this seems that they truly, sincerely believe that this wasn't a lie, because people who lie, they usually are not willing to suffer for something they know is a lie. So, to bring this home, what are the facts? The facts are, there's really facts that are agreed by a consensus of scholars who study this topic, whether they're Christians or non-Christians. They believe that these are the bedrock, historical bedrock. Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. He was placed in a tomb. His tomb was then found empty. And then the disciples were transformed, experienced something that transformed them to believe that Jesus was alive. And then, what are the possible hypotheses? Let's think about it. There are a number of them that have been proposed, and we'll think about it. Maybe Jesus just passed out, so it's called the Swoon Theory, that he just revived in the tomb. He wasn't really dead. Then there is the disciples stole the body, so that's the story that the Jews proposed. Then we will think about maybe disciples hallucinated. Maybe Jesus didn't rise from the dead, but they just hallucinated that he did. Maybe even some scholar proposed that it was a twin. There was a secret twin that no one knew about, or someone else who just looked very similar to Jesus, and he appeared and deceived all the disciples. And and then we'll think about is it rational to believe that Jesus rose from the dead? So let's go through each of these. So the theory, the Swoon Theory, that says that Jesus passed out, it admits or agrees that Jesus was buried, that the tomb was empty, and that disciples sincerely believed in Jesus' resurrection. But they say Jesus didn't die on the cross. He passed out. And there are problems with this. First of all, it's extremely unlikely to survive crucifixion if you're nailed. There might have been some situations when they would tie the person with ropes to the cross. And someone might survive for days on such a cross. The Romans were expert killers. It's also very unlikely to think that they would. The accounts even say they've checked that he was dead. They pierced his heart, his side, and confirmed that he was indeed dead. And the liquid, not only blood, but also that liquid, the plasma, also flowed out. And then. Also, even just the tomb, being placed in the tomb for 2 days, we know that he didn't eat anything from Friday morning to Sunday morning. So eat or drink. So it's not the best conditions for healing in a tomb. And then even if you survive this, and you somehow manage to push away the stone from your tomb, and then show yourself to disciples, you're almost dead there. You have wounds all over you, you're in serious need of medical attention. You will not convince anyone that you are the risen, glorious Messiah, conquering death. He would be basically just almost on the verge of dying. So he convincing them, the disciples, that he actually was victorious over death would take a psychological miracle. So that's I think it's not very rational. Maybe it was a conspiracy. Well, so this theory proposes that Jesus did die, yes, and he was buried, and the tomb was found empty, but this is because the disciples stole the body and lied about the resurrection. And as we said, liars make poor martyrs, so people who know that it's dangerous, that the message is dangerous, wouldn't risk their lives for something they know is a lie. So we think they sincerely believed what they said. And then still, that theory does not explain why James and Paul converted. They had no reason to believe this. Paul was an enemy of the Christian church. So why did he change his mind? What convinced him? Stolen body would not have convinced him. And in the end, the conspiracy essentially is very difficult to hold. The more people know about it or are in on it, the easier it is that one of them gets interrogated and just slips and admits that all of it was a scam. And there has been a situation once where several most powerful people in the world, the Watergate scandal, I think, they tried to maintain a certain conspiracy and they failed at it after 2 weeks. And one of them, after investigating this topic, he says, well, we were trying, the most powerful people in the world, we were trying to keep a conspiracy and we didn't manage. How can those fishermen and poor people manage to maintain this conspiracy for so long? It's not really credible. Then maybe the disciples hallucinated. So this theory says, yes, Jesus did die and he was buried. The disciples did really genuinely believe that Jesus rose from the dead, that they saw him alive. But the tomb was not empty, really. They just hallucinated the appearance of Jesus. Well, the problems with that are that, if the body was still there in the grave, then it would be very easy to dismantle the rumor just by producing the body, showing, hey, here is the body, he didn't rise. And then we would it's also group hallucination. So I once spoke, we invited to Manchester, the Christian Union invited to Manchester a psychiatrist who was talking about delusions. And he said that group delusions are medically impossible because they're subjective, they're a bit like dreams. Hallucinations are a bit like dreams. I cannot just say, well, I don't know, to my friend, say like, hey, join me in my dream. I'm dreaming about a vacation somewhere in a nice place. Join me in my dream. We will have a free vacation. It doesn't work. You can't dream the same dream. And here, the literature is that I think the best that people thought we could have a delusion that is shared between people. Maybe sometimes husband and wife can have a certain delusion projecting onto each other, and then by talking enough, they get one kind of complete story, but that's only two people. And then any more than two people, a group hallucination like that is essentially impossible. We have no record of ever being one delusion of groups. And then in the end, we would have to actually have many different hallucinations. So we would have to have a group hallucination of women. Then we would have to have the group hallucination of the 12 disciples. Then we would have to have a hallucination of Cleopas, who was somewhere else, not one of those, on the road to Emmaus. Then we would have to have a hallucination of Paul and James, who were enemies and didn't really miss Jesus. They were happy that he was dead. Well, Paul was happy that he was dead. I don't know about James, the brother, but yeah. But the point is that it would take a miracle to have so many hallucinations, and for the Jewish authorities somehow to forget where the body is. So I don't think this is a credible hypothesis. So maybe someone has substituted Jesus. This is really genuinely someone proposed this, and now someone impersonated Jesus. Well, again, that doesn't explain the empty tomb, because the body would still be there. It is actually very difficult. So I don't know if there are any twins here. Are there? No?
I think they're not here.
Okay, well, apparently even twins have trouble impersonating each other. That after, to a group of friends, they would basically maybe be able to impersonate the other twin, maybe for a minute, they say, but not really. So here we are having, especially that James was the brother of Jesus. He would have recognized it quite easily, whether it's Jesus or not. And the disciples themselves would also quickly see that it wasn't him. And again, it does not explain how Paul converted. Why did he believe in Jesus? If that was what sort of appearance would convince him? If that was a different person, just telling him that I'm Jesus, he just would not be convinced. Okay, so now the remaining option is that maybe Jesus actually rose from the dead. So that hypothesis would explain all of the historical data, but you might argue, well, but miracles should certainly be last on the list, right? The least probable of all explanations should be an explanation that says, oh, it was a miracle. So let's think about it. Well, first of all, I would like to say that yes, this is the last one, but all the previous ones have failed, so we're down to this one. And now I would like to think about, what does actually this miracle entail? So why is this improbable according to people? So according to this hypothesis, you would have to say that, God exists, first of all. So if you're an atheist, you don't believe in God, then, you will just say resurrection is impossible, period. It cannot be. Something else must have happened. And then you would have to say, given that Jesus claimed himself to be God, then essentially he was blaspheming. That's why he was even crucified in the first place. Under accusation, the charge was he was making himself equal to God. So that is blasphemy. And God, so not only God exists, but God also approved of Jesus, Jesus' words. So he was actually, God became a human being. So now the probability, what are the chances that God exists and that he became a human being? Are these two things very improbable? Let's think. So first of all, I would like to argue as a person who thinks a lot about God's existence, that there are good reasons to believe that God exists. I'm not going to go into all of them, I'm just going to mention them. I think that God is the best explanation of certain facts about what we know about nature and about just existence. So God is the best explanation why anything at all exists, why there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists. So that's called the argument from contingency. Then God is the best explanation why the universe behaves regularly, why there are even laws of physics. I'm a physicist. I believe that, if I repeat certain things in a lab, it will usually happen the same way. But, why is that? They are just descriptions of reality. And I think that God is the best explanation for why the universe even behaves, has any sort of laws. Then God is the best explanation why the universe can support life. That's the fine-tuning argument. Fundamental constants of nature are specifically chosen so that if the universe were slightly different, certain numbers in the foundations of the universe were slightly different, the universe would not form any stars, any planets, nothing. It would be just a soup of atoms, and that's it. So no life of any kind could exist anywhere. Why is that? I think that God is the best explanation of that. I think that God is the best explanation why the life exists. Scientists are now looking into how probable is to have a replicating organism, even a replicating molecule. We have no idea, and we are actually have good evidence that it's just impossible. It's clearly an element of design, that someone very intelligent designed life to even start. So that's I think the design. So it's a bit like a watch. If you see a watch, you see, it's just couldn't happen by accident, and that's kind of what we see here. And then, there are certain facts about consciousness. I can argue for those if you ask me. I have about 7 arguments that the soul exists, and if the soul exists, an immaterial substance, so we are not just our brains, but there is a soul that is the real us, then that would require a creator of the soul, an immaterial creator. And then, in the end, I would say that, also the widespread religious experiences show that actually it's quite intuitive. Most people are religious on some level, in one way or another. And it shows that perhaps it's not irrational, that maybe those religious experiences point to something real, that God exists. So, so I think it is rational to believe that God exists, and therefore miracles are possible. A God who created the universe is perfectly able to bring a person back to life. But is it probable that he would become a human person? So I would say there are certain reasons that God would want to help or become a human person. He would, for example, want to help people solve the problem of sin. So most religions actually have this concept of sin, that if you do something evil, you either deserve punishment, or maybe there would be a certain sacrifice. You should present a sacrifice to atone for your sins. So here, God would want to help. As a loving God, he would want to help people to solve this problem in which we are. So that would be the reason. So Jesus sacrificing himself, or God sacrificing himself, providing the perfect sacrifice, would be one reason. God would want to show people how they should live. Most religions, or most people actually, just believe there is a good and evil way of living, and a good God would want to explain to people how we should live. And then a loving God would also want to show solidarity with his creatures. So there are, for example, certain people, parents, for example, if they have a child who undergoes cancer treatment and loses all of their hair, sometimes parents shave their hair as well, right? And they go bald because they want to sympathize with the child. And in this sense, here God would want to also sympathize with us, with our suffering, and share, also experience the same suffering that we experience. So, in light of all of these reasons, it seems like God, does have good reasons to become a human person, and the God who would become a human person would essentially provide the sacrifice, would teach, show, explain certain moral lifestyle rules or advice. So he would show how to live, and he would want to show solidarity, experiencing the pain of life. So I think it's not unreasonable to see that the incarnate God would do the sorts of things that Jesus did. So it seems like Jesus does fit. It's consistent with him being the incarnate God. So our verdict is that incarnation and resurrection are not absurdly unlikely. It doesn't happen very often. I think it only happened once, but they're not absurdly unlikely. All the other and we do have good evidence that Jesus did rise from the dead. All the other alternative explanations are essentially absurdly unlikely, and they fail to explain all of the evidence. So our conclusion would be that, I think it is rational to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Heng, would you like to say something?
Oh, yeah. So, is that another slide?
No.
Okay. So we're coming to the end now. So the question is still, is it rational to believe that Jesus rose bodily from the dead? Yes, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. Because we have good evidence that Jesus did in fact rose from the dead, as we have explained. And also there are good reasons to believe in God. There are good reasons that God would become a human person, as Jesus did as well. So we're coming to the end now, and perhaps I could end this with a personal remarks. So once again, as I said in the beginning, I was not born and raised in a Christian family. I did not grow up in a church. I never went to a Sunday school and so on. And I only became a Christian last year in October. And so that means that I spent most of my life as a non-Christian, as a Buddhist, in a Buddhist family, and so on. And, I had heard about Christianity, and I had been in contact, before I became a Christian, I heard about Christianity. I'd become in contact with Christians. Of course, I was not Christian, but of course, I looked at the evidence, and I felt like the evidence was strong. I was very convinced. But of course, the evidence is not the only thing why I am a Christian. Because you could, in theory, believe that the evidence is true, that Jesus rose from the dead, and yet not become a Christian. You could say, he rose from the dead, but I think he is just one of the gods, like somebody believe in Hinduism would say. Or like a Jewish scholars, one of the Jewish scholars who believed that Jesus rose from the dead, but he did not become a Christian. He thought yes, he rose from the dead, but he was the Messiah, but the Messiah to only the Gentiles and so on. So the evidence is strong. I found it very strong, but also I became a Christian because of the mercy and forgiveness of God. I had been convicted by God that I am a sinful person and I was in need of a savior, and the only savior was Jesus. So for some of our friends out there who are not Christians, I would invite you and say don't take our words for it. Maybe don't believe in this presentation at all. But grab a New Testament, grab the Bible and read it and investigate it for yourself. And perhaps if you could, I believe that if you sincerely seek God, He will reveal Himself to you. Grab the Bible, grab the New Testament and read it for yourself and pray that God will reveal Himself to you. I believe that if you do that, He will in fact reveal Himself to you, just as He did to me. So, and even if, at the end of it, after reading everything, you are still not a Christian, you will have read good historical documents. So it seems to me like it's a win-win situation for you. Why not read it? So thank you for listening, and I believe we also have a Q&A. So if you have questions, just ask. I love these Q&A sessions because Tim will answer every question. So.